look who is talking about civilian casualty, the masters of civilian casualty. Israel is this entity where the law does not apply.
There is this Oriental savagery that they're evoking in a lot of their commentary. What's the end game here?
Animosity towards Gaza in particular is more than anywhere else because that's where the most resistance comes from.
The Western propaganda machine is in full motion. On my way in today, I saw a concerted effort on the front pages of British newspapers with zero evidence that Hamas has beheaded 40 babies last week. This was repeated on the BBC and has been picked up by media influencers. On a greater scale, it seems to me that Israel, aided by the West, are conditioning Western public opinion for a final solution, the effective expunging of Gaza from the map. This slow, steady war machine is exceptionalising Palestinian violence, real or concocted, to further its aims. This is the Iraq war all over again. To help us understand this subtle propaganda machine, it is my pleasure to have Moazzam Begg on the show. Moazzam Begg is a former Guantanamo Bay detainee and senior director for the UK-based campaigning group Cage. Moazzam Begg, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and my pleasure to be here with you again.
Well, look, Jazakallah Khair for joining us at such short notice. Today we want to talk about the events last Saturday. I know it's an issue that's moving forward at a very rapid pace. We're speaking today on Wednesday after the Hamas attacks, let's call them, on outside of Gaza. But what I want to focus on today is the propaganda effort we've witnessed since Saturday. Now, it seems to me that this propaganda is pretty subtle. It's a subtle endeavor. Can you please just explain from your side what you've witnessed in this past week?
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I've been relatively shocked, and it's not easy to shock me based on things that I've seen in the past in terms of the dehumanization process of Muslims. But literally, the Palestinian resistance, they're saying it's Hamas, but they actually mean all of people in Gaza are animals. And as a result of them being labeled by Israeli senior administrators and military people as animals, they have said that they will cut off gas, cut off electricity, which they have done already, cut off water, and no food. Now, Gaza is already besieged. It has the sea on one side, Egypt, which is a small corridor, on the other side, and Israel on the other. And to besiege and then to cut off food and most basic supplies, including aid, which the Israelis have threatened to bomb if it comes through the Al Arish side in Egypt, is openly declaring that you're intending to and are carrying out war crimes. The part of the propaganda of this is that because we have said that you are baby killers and that you are rapists, because those are the two major allegations against them, then there are no rights for you at all, and you will be obliterated. And for that to be carried on our newspapers, on British newspapers, who claim to have the highest global standards of media scrutiny, the source of the story where it's been alleged that 40 babies were beheaded is one person talking to one media outlet without any verification at all, without any photographic evidence, without any witnesses, and with attempts being made by various media organizations who haven't parroted the same story to ask the American military, the Israeli military, can you confirm? And they have 3 times, on 3 occasions, said we cannot confirm at this point.
Yeah. Can you, I mean, for our international viewers, they may not know that most of the British press this morning had that 40 babies were beheaded by Hamas on their front pages. Many of them just had it in quotes, so to claim that it was an allegation rather than fact. But this story was debunked maybe a couple of hours. I think it was a Turkish news agency, Anadolu agency, which spoke to a senior Israeli official who said there's just no evidence for that. So even Israelis debunked it. Why did they proceed with the story, do you think?
Well, unfortunately, and this is really the sad part about this, is that you have the Goebbels theory, the Nazi theory, which is known as the big lie. And the big lie is that the bigger the lie is, the more often it's repeated, the more people will believe it. Now, that was the lies and the kind of propaganda of the Nazis. For the Zionist and Israeli state that was born out of that, to take that on is truly, truly shocking. Why the British media would do so? Knowing that if it comes back and they find that the story is entirely debunked, it doesn't really matter. Who is Hamas going to take them to court?
Yeah.
Are they going to be taken to court for defamation? No one's going to care, because now they're an entity that's at war with a strong ally of Britain.
Yeah.
So this reminds us of the type of language that has come in past conflicts, when Muslims in particular have been demonized, whether it's they all or a fifth of them support ISIS, or whether it's weapons of mass destruction that are loomingly going to destroy the West. It's from the same playbook that we can create this hype. And in the end, if we're wrong, there will be no accountability.
You were a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. And if I remember right, prior to that, you were kept in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, the Americans, they labeled all Muslims, all Taliban or non-Taliban suspects as unlawful combatants, if I remember right. Is there an example? Is there an overlap here with Gaza? Are they trying to dehumanize them in order to portray them as almost subhuman, or at least the rules of war do not apply to these so-called savages, in order to brutalize, if not expunge, the entire population?
Well, what's happened is that Hamas has carried out, as far as they're concerned, a military operation. In that it's possible, and I think we can't deny that it's possible, that civilians may have been killed.
Yeah.
But look who is talking about civilian casualty.
Yeah.
The masters of civilian casualty, the masters of collateral damage, that to get one person, they'll kill 100. And the United States has done that in the war on terrorism. Israel has done that since its birth.
Yeah.
So if this is a military operation that is being carried out by the Israelis, then it should be carried out under the laws of war. And to express, see, the difference here is that I've never heard this before, is to express the intention to carry out war crimes. I've not heard that before, with the belief that there will be complete impunity. No one's going to hold us to account for this. And the reason why is because the enemy we're fighting is as equal to or worse than ISIS. Now, we can analyze what's the difference between Hamas and ISIS in ideology and also in methodology. But anybody who's to scratch the surface, anybody who understands both organizations will know that they are worlds apart. But as they say, don't let the facts get in the way of a good demonization.
Yeah, I get the impression that, as you said, they're dehumanizing the Palestinians. There is this Oriental savagery that they're evoking in a lot of their commentary. What's the end game here? Why do they want to portray Hamas as these subhuman savages, do you think?
It's absolutely crystal clear to me. If you look back at the history of the Palestinian conflict, every single resistance movement, whether it's secular, such as Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization, whether it's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is leftist, or whether it's the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or whether it's Islamic Jihad and Hamas, the common factor between all of them is that they are all resistance group who believe in armed resistance, and every single one of them has been labeled by the Israeli government and by the Western governments as a terrorist entity, meaning that fighting occupation, which is enshrined within international law and within Islamic law, the right to defend yourself and the right to fight against occupiers, has all of a sudden been done away with because Israel is this entity where the law does not apply, where rules, ordinary rules that the rest of the world is supposed to live by, they don't apply. And that's because Israel has an end game of taking control of the entirety of Palestine. And anyone who resists needs to be obliterated. That's why the animosity towards Gaza in particular is more than anywhere else, because that's where the most resistance comes from.
There have been some liberals in the press talk about how the Hamas is effectively scored an own go here by engaging in this military operation. It's in effect given the Americans and the British carte blanche, or an excuse to allow Israel to act with impunity. And they evoke Gandhi and they evoke Martin Luther King as examples that the Palestinians should be modeling rather than violent resistance struggles. I mean, what's your perspective on that? Would the Palestinian cause be better if they modeled themselves on these pacifist characters?
Well, pacifism has its place, but when you have an aggressive, brutal, militaristic enemy such as the Zionist state of Israel, which has been in recent months, in recent years, described as an apartheid state, or a state that operates apartheid policies by Amnesty International, by Liberty, by Human Rights Watch, when it's a state that's known to target children, what uses administrative detention to hold people without charge or trial, whether it's the targeting of young people, of half of whom constitute the population of Gaza, meaning they have no mercy upon the children. I think that, as they say, they've tried every other avenue. And when you're besieged and starved and are dependent upon your sworn enemy for things like gas and electricity and basic survival, then what do you do when you have seen the systematic displacement of your people? If you look at the settler colonies building right next door to Gaza and have essentially occupied the whole of what's left of Palestine. You see those famous photographs or pictures, images of Palestine 1948, 1967, 73, and now, and you can see it's gone from an entire state to little pockets, 3 little pockets around the entire region. So it tells you everything that you need to know, and everybody knows what's happening. There have been a multitude of United Nations resolutions condemning Israel for the settlements, for example, and the treatment of the Palestinian people. None of that has counted for anything. And that is because the United Nations itself, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, 3 of them are backers, supporters, and the creators of Israel, United States, Britain, and France.
Do you think this propaganda effort is working? I mean, many Westerners, you and I may follow the situation much more closely, and we see the injustices. And of course, we're united with the Palestinians through creed. But many Westerners, they have a very weak understanding of the conflict. And for many of them, the conflict began on Saturday. History began on Saturday. And what Israel is doing now is legitimately responding to Palestinian attacks on them. Do you think that propaganda effort is actually succeeding to let's say, to radicalize Western populations?
So earlier on, President Zelensky tweeted something about supporting Israel, and we know that he's been supporting Israel and so forth. But he said something about, I'm not interested in institutions and governments, I'm interested in people and the support of the people. Well, where are you seeing around the world demonstrations in support of Israel? When do you ever see them? The answer is you never do.
Right.
You see throughout the world repeatedly, because in the end, ordinary people do get it. They're not stupid. They see the aggressor. They see the irony. They see David and the Goliath. King David and his star is the symbol of the Israeli flag. But it's actually the Palestinians today who are swinging the rocks and the stones through the slingshot against the Goliath. So ordinary people can see that and recognize that the support of the ordinary people is with the Palestinians. They don't have powerful Western or Eastern military backers. If they did, then Israel wouldn't be attacking them in this way. They'd be afraid. They'd actually be afraid that these guys have firepower. I mean, the Israelis have about 650 aircraft, of which I think something like 250 are fighter jets. The Palestinians, their air force is motorized hand gliders. That's their air force. So you can see the disparity in all of this. And most people, they recognize, they see that there's a brutality against the people, but those vested in power and vested in the supporting and propping up of the state of Israel are Western governments, and they don't really care what the people say in relation to Palestine.
Moazzam, I've seen on the internet, a number of Muslims have just been taken aback by just how duplicitous the West is. Joe Biden yesterday went on a tirade on Twitter. I think he tweeted out 2 or 3 tweets where he called the Palestinians or Hamas, as he likened them to ISIS, and they were savages. And they've been taken aback by just how horrible or how intense that Western response has been in support for Israel. I mean, what do you think is behind this, no holds barred, this complete green light they've given to Israel?
I mean, look, Hamas in and of itself is the political wing, and Izzuddin al-Qassam is the military wing. So if you have a political wing, it means, therefore, that you have politics and you have diplomacy and that you want to talk to governments, and you do, and you have been. And that's what Hamas had been doing. Of course, it had been labeled a banned terrorist organization by Britain just last year. But prior to that, they were engaged in politics and constantly. So to say, well, they're the same about ISIS, well, where was ISIS's political wing? It didn't have one.
Yeah.
So it's very easy just to scratch the surface and to kind of settle, to take that apart. But in the end, this all comes back down. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter which entity you are. If you're a Muslim and you believe in self-determination and fighting occupation from a Western-supported enemy, you are a barbarian Muslim and you are less than human. And I know this from a personal experience. When the Americans, when they held us, they literally said that you are less than human.
Really?
Literally, they said that you are not prisoners of war, you are not civilians, you are enemy aliens. Literally, that's the terminology they use. Enemy aliens, meaning something from outer space, something that's not human, and something that's the enemy.
Right. Tell me about, you mentioned Vladimir Zelensky in one of your responses, and there does seem to be an enormous duplicity in the way Western liberals treated the Ukraine crisis and how they treat the Palestinian crisis. And I used to think it was ignorance, but I actually don't think anymore it's ignorance. I mean, you've got very well-versed, very knowledgeable broadcasters like Sheila Fogarty and, James O'Brien on LBC, who were, during the Ukraine crisis, every show was about the Ukrainians and their fierce struggle and how they've stood up to the war machine of the Russians and how their response is legitimate. Yet they can't find a similar feature there in the Palestinian crisis. How do you understand that duplicity there?
Well, one of the things that, again, I guess I'm not shocked, that we'd hoped that perhaps there may have been a scintilla of understanding and association, that if somebody is fighting an occupier, I also show solidarity with that oppressed people who are fighting the occupier.
Yeah.
But here Zelensky shows very clearly that his sympathies lie with the occupier. And again, so to be absolutely crystal clear, the territories that are held by or adjacent to where the Israelis are have been described under international law as the occupied territories. It's not a mantra people are throwing around. These are actually occupied lands. And so for him then to say that I side with the oppressed Israelis who are fighting terrorism, well, that's what Russia calls you. Russia calls Ukrainians, especially in the Donbass region and the Crimea region, which has a large number of Russians in there, have said that the Ukrainians came and forced themselves and terrorized this region. Therefore, they had to come and assist them. And so they regard you as terrorists, and they regard you as usurpers and Western-backed abusers. So why should, if you can't show consistency, why should anybody back you, especially from the Muslim world?
Yes.
And I think that because of that, it's going to be hard for people in the Muslim world, because nobody, hardly anybody from the Muslim world, even those who are now seeking some kind of a normalization with Israel, hardly anyone has condemned the Palestinians, and all have said something in relation to the brutality of the Israelis. So it's kind of it's thrown a gauntlet down for a lot of the Muslim countries.
Again, the Western media is very superficial in the way it views this conflict. But one, I don't know if it's I think it's a dominant narrative, especially in the American press, that seems to come through, is that, well, the Muslim populations or the Arab populations have really given up on the Palestinian cause, and now they're signing the Abraham Accords and normalization, and Saudi Arabia is next. And even with this intention of Mohammed bin Salman to sign the normalization with Israel, there hasn't really been the type of disagreement on the streets of the Arab world. And so, the argument is that they've moved on, and now Israel is a permanent fixture in the Middle East, and these states have resigned themselves to the realpolitik and decided that they're going to work with Israel. I mean, is that an accurate explanation of what you see of the Muslim masses?
Yeah, I mean, even to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe there is a sense in the minds of some of people within the Gulf, for example, is that this animosity needs to end, that the war needs to end. We need to have peace. Let's just say that's their rationale.
Mm-hmm.
But what they've seen now is, how do you have peace with a usurper, an occupier, a torturer?
Yeah.
How do you do that? Is that not capitulation, and is that not handing over to the entity that has carried out a mass of war crimes? And as I said, the litmus test here has been, well, okay, what do you do now when there's conflict?
Yes.
You're trying to normalize that. What do you do now? And I've seen from countries like Saudi Arabia and others pretty strong statements against the Israelis and what they've done. So this tells you that the attempt to normalize cannot be at the expense of taking the wrong side in the conflict.
How do we combat this war machine? I mean, if we are to connect the dots and say the front pages of the papers this morning, Joe Biden's speech, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gives a similar speech yesterday. Keir Starmer at the party conference yesterday talks about, how Israel has a right to self-defense. So they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, and the major press, all of the media outlets are really anti-Palestinian at this stage, and as you said, portraying them as animals, or worse than animals, as subhuman. It sometimes feels like we're fighting a lost cause. How do we respond, or how do we counter this behemoth that's out there, this propaganda machine that really is exercising a lot of control over the minds of ordinary people?
Well, as you said, there's a behemoth, there's a massive media machine in the English-speaking world. But let's just remember, you've got an entire different world. Just take Al Jazeera. Just take the headlines in Al Jazeera. None of them, not a single one of them, I wouldn't even call them alternative media, just other media that millions of people look to. They're not looking at it that way at all. They're not even reporting it that way.
Yeah.
And so then we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why not? Look at the rest of the world. Look at the Arab world. Look at the China. Look at other countries in Asia and Africa. What are they saying? And do they constitute the rest of the world? And very quickly you come to the conclusion, as often when they say the international community condemns. But who is the international community? Europe? The handful of countries in Europe, or the actual rest of the world? So really needed to look at what do the rest of the world actually think. And then on top of that, say that here we may feel defeated, as in the language, but in the rest of the world it doesn't feel like that. They know who the oppressor is.
Yeah.
Agreed, they are not united on what to do about it, and mostly impotent. But I think they all, if you were to go onto the ordinary Arab street, even in the places where they've attempted to normalize Israel and ask them what you think about this conflict and who is the aggressor, they will say straight, without hesitation, Israel. And Israel has been the aggressor since its inception.
Can I ask you about Keir Starmer, actually? Because, again, many Muslims, and I think maybe we spoke about this when you were last on the show, many Muslims still hold out that their best bet is the Labour Party, because the Labour Party tends to be more embracing of Muslims, and there are more Muslim parliamentarians who belong to the Labour Party. But again, the leadership of the Labour Party have, shamelessly come on the side of Israel here. Even those Muslims within the Labour, I mean, Sadiq Khan is a good example of that, have not commented on Israel and have on Palestine and talked about what is the genocide that's taking place in Palestine and have given their unreserved support to Israel. I mean, how do you assess the Labour Party when it comes to the Muslim community and political engagement?
Well, of course, over the past 2 decades, mostly during the war on terrorism, the left, the traditional left, have supported the Muslims. Of course,
I mean, Corbyn was a very strong supporter.
Indeed, he was. Indeed, he was of most Muslim issues, but not necessarily others. And one of the reasons why he's thrown out or and there's a coup against him was his position on Palestine. Was his position on Hamas? Was his position on engagement and dialogue? And that's one of the reasons why they said he was unelectable. That's not true, because he had the largest mandate of anyone in terms of membership of the Labour Party. But it was because they could not stomach somebody who held those views on Palestine and Israel in Her Majesty's loyal opposition, right?
Yes.
So Keir Starmer is the normalizer of Israeli aggression against the Palestinians. He was asked just very recently, I think today, about Israel has said that it will cut off the water supply and food supplies and electricity. And his response was, Israel has the right to defend itself, but that is not defense. That is a war crime. That is starving a population, an entire population, through collective punishment. So he's just expressed, as the former director of public prosecutions,
a human rights lawyer,
he's just expressed his intention or his support of the intention of the Israelis to carry out war crimes. So I think somebody like him, for a statement like that, should be in the dock.
I sent out on Twitter, or X, I think they call it now, yesterday, but I'm going to be interviewing you about the propaganda effort. And a number of people spoke to me, DM'd me and said, can you ask Moazzam, how do we find a space to vocalize our disagreement with what's going on, in particular in the corporate space? They commented that in many of the big city firms, you've got emails that are being sent around in support of Israel, condemning, Hamas, and condemning, in effect, the Palestinians and their cause. And, they feel constrained. They feel that if they were to even comment on this issue, they're going to be labeled and it's going to hamper maybe their careers. There is this fear, and I can see it. It's a palpable fear. It's a fear also in the education system here, where young Muslims find it very difficult to vocalize their support for Palestine. How do we find a space where we can do and give justice to our brothers and sisters?
One of the things with fear is that it's often self-created. So when you say, I'm afraid of X, Y, Z happening, rightly so, but that's because you've told yourself. What if you tell yourself, I'm not afraid? What if you tell yourself, well, I'm going to say X, Y, Z, and damn the consequence? Because I feel so passionately about this, damn the consequence. If they label me, if they target me, if they throw me out of my job, so what? I'm prepared to give. Somebody asked me this as a question in the mosque yesterday. I was doing a talk about this, said, what can we do? And I said, what are you prepared to do? The question is, what are you prepared to do? And so, for example, you can see there are people who are mostly non-Muslims called Pal Action, who carry out acts of disobedience, sabotage even, against Elbit systems, for example, who are arming the Israeli government for money, of course.
Yes.
And using those weapons to kill Palestinians.
These are defense companies.
In defense companies.
Yeah.
So they are carrying out little acts of sabotage, throwing paint over the building or whatever it is. They get arrested, they get a slap on the wrist, they get a bit of a fine. But they're carrying out something that is disrupting the machinery that is killing Palestinians.
Yeah.
For us, if we are too afraid even to make a tweet, too afraid to make a dua, to go to your mosque and say to the imam, can you please make dua for the mujahideen of Palestine? You don't have to say Hamas, you don't have to say any group at all. Say, oh, Allahumma ansur al-mujahideen fi Palestine. Could you do that today? Because if you do that, because that dua then is going to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's whose help we need the most. But if you're too afraid even to do that, then you have to question yourself, what are you prepared to do then? Just put a little bit of money to an aid charity who says they're sending money to Gaza when Gaza is blocked off. So how is that money getting there? Gaza is entirely besieged. How is that money and aid actually getting there? So we have to be able to think outside of the box and do things that we wouldn't normally want to do. And we have to be prepared sometimes to disrupt the system. And let's not forget, not every law is just or moral. It may be a law, but hiding Jews during Nazi Germany was against the law. Saving or protecting escaped slaves in America was against the law. And here, speaking out against the injustice of the Palestinians, if that's against the law, then we have to be prepared to break it.
Yeah. I think that a number of Muslims find it difficult. I mean, on my way in today, I was listening to a talk show, and a Muslim called up, and he was trying his best. He was trying to express the Muslim view and give solidarity to Palestine. But as you know, these radio anchors are very polished, and this particular with Sheila Fogarty was able to make mincemeat out of it, in inverted commas, and pick holes in his argument. And the brother tried his best, but he just wasn't able to converse and express himself very well. So I think there is a need for some training here so that we understand, or we get the arguments, and we can fine-tune the responses in a better way. So maybe if I ask you some questions and you tell me how we should respond to that. So if the question which always goes, perennial question, it's come up for every interview, shamelessly sometimes, but do you condemn the actions of Hamas on Saturday? How would you respond to that?
The question is the wrong question, and I'm not forced to answer it. You can't ask me to condemn something without condemning something that preceded it.
Right.
So if you begin the question and say to me, I condemn what Israel has done for the past 70 years against the innocent civilian Palestinians who have a far greater ability and history of killing civilians, you begin that as the premise, then I will say yes, because you are equal and understand and have established a principle, then I'm prepared to do that. But if you're not, don't ask me that question.
The killing of civilians, Hamas deliberately targeted civilians in that action. Over 1,000 people died. Many of them were civilians, and I think we have to accept that that did happen. And so that places Hamas at a greater degree of immorality than, say, the Israeli army that supposedly precisely targets military infrastructure. I mean, at least, do you condemn the act of targeting civilians?
I think one of the things that the Israeli government does has taught us how do we deal with the issue of civilians. First of all, Muslims cannot allow their oppressor, their aggressor, their torturer, their murderer to become their teacher. So if the Prophet ﷺ has taught us not to target a certain group of people, including non-combatants, women, children, elderly, worshippers, then we follow that regardless of what the enemy does.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the premise. That is what Hamas fighters I have seen have said, and they claim to follow. So then if that is your code of conduct, the killing of civilians outside of that either is done in opposition to because you have flagrantly disobeyed the laws of Islam, or you've done it by mistake. And in the same way, the Israelis will say that we don't target civilians. Right. We don't target civilians, but this is what they say. They say that anybody those schools and those hospitals and those universities are not universities and hospitals and schools. That is where the terrorists hide. Therefore, we will target them. So what they've done is they've circumvented. And they've said, we've just said that those civilian places are not civilian places. What's your evidence for that? You don't have to give any. You've just said it. And then you've said that we will starve the entire population, cut off from the water, not just for Hamas, but for everybody that lives there. So what you've said essentially is that we believe in the targeting of civilians. And so you're in no moral position to say to Hamas, you shouldn't target civilians, though I would say to Hamas, stick to the Quran and to the Sunnah about all of your engagement, because that's in the end where victory comes from.
The argument that, in effect, there is just no negotiation with Palestinians or with certain factions in the Palestinians and with Muslims at large, because fundamentally we don't accept the presence of an Israeli state in the Middle East. Israel doesn't have a right to exist, they say. I've seen, again, lots of radio broadcasters confront Muslim callers with this. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Israel has a right to exist, but not on Palestine. Because if your existence come from, it's a simple analogy, that you live in a house and you've lived there for hundreds of years, or your family have, and somebody comes along and says, well, actually, my family was there 10,000 years ago when humankind began, and now it's my house. And if you don't get out from there, I will butcher all of you. So we'll give you the garage. You can go in the garage and stay there. And every time you try to come back, we will tell the rest of the world that you are an abuser and that you are a terrorist and that you are subhuman. It's because if you put it down to that level, a person can think about, what if that happened in my house? It's a very simple thing. That's what Israel is. Israel has, and one of the things that's really important, Nazism, Zionism, fascism were all born in Europe. These are all European ideologies. They're not Arab or Muslim ideologies. They're not from Asia. They're not from the Middle East. They're from Europe. Europe carried out the pogroms, carried out the final solution against the Jews. Europeans did, under European ideology. And then under European ideology, the displacement of the Palestinians happened, and the bringing in physically of people from of a Jewish background, and then filling and taking their land. That, to this day, has not been addressed. And the very people who facilitated that and presented that as a viable option are the same people who annihilated the Native Americans from their land. And to this day, they've not answered for that. They've not answered for the fact that they've reduced the Native Americans to living on reservations on their own land. They've said, oh, it was a terrible thing, but they've not repaired it. And they cannot, because it is a crime of history. And the acceptance of that is the acceptance of ethnic cleansing.
There's a suggestion that there is an Israeli claim, or in fact, there is. I find that many non-Muslims, because they don't deeply understand the conflict, understand the history, they have an impression that most of the inhabitants of Israel were there prior to the Nakba, prior to the establishment of the state, and that they have an equal claim to that land, to that of Palestinian Muslims. Just shed some light on the citizens of Israel and where they're from, because I really believe most people just don't understand the basic demography.
So I was just looking at this recently. In 1517, 1.7% of the entire population of the Holy Land were Jews.
Right.
Up until the early part of the 20th century, before the First World War, it was around 24,000.
Right.
After the Balfour Declaration and then the establishment of the State of Israel in 47, 48, they started to bring in tens of thousands. But only then, up until that time, it was about 84,000.
Right.
Versus a population of several million Muslims and Arabs. Right. So it tells you, during that time and up until now, they have brought in populations of different types of Jews from different parts of the world, from Russia, from Eastern Europe and beyond, and filled it, including Arab Jews.
Right.
And interestingly, Arab Jews who lived in harmony in Morocco, in Yemen, in Iraq, and so forth. When Zionism came along and said that you don't belong in those lands and there's a land for you, then the hatred was started to build mutually between both sides. Whereas Jews had lived and actually escaped from anti-Semitic Europe, Britain and the rest of Western Europe, where they were being literally tortured, murdered and killed, and they sought refuge and were given refuge in Andalus and in Ottoman Turkey. But by the time Zionism started as a movement, once again, the Jews felt like they didn't belong because Zionism told them, you don't belong.
So what is their claim then to that land? Is it that thousands of years ago or whatever, the Jews lived on this land? Is that it?
Essentially, that's it. There's ever been 2 times in the history of Judaism and mankind wherever there was an Israeli homeland or a Jewish homeland. Right. One was the time of Dawood alayhi salam and Suleiman, which was 2 prophets, which is,
who knows?
Several thousands of years ago. We don't know exactly when. I don't think anybody knows exactly when. And then 1948.
Right.
Prior to that, there's nothing. And even if you look in civilizational terms, different civilizations contribute different things to civilization. Not to say Jews haven't contributed, but there's no space for them. There's very little space. The only space they have to contribute from that time till now, up until 1948, is within Muslim lands, where they had rights as Ahlul Kitab, as people of the book.
There is the anti-Semitism label which is constantly applied to Muslims. Recently we had demonstrations in London against Israeli action in Gaza, and inevitably the label anti-Semitism was used against them. How do we escape that label? Do we have a problem in the way we use our way we express our disagreement with the state of Israel and its actions? How do we escape that?
Well, let's just start religiously first. The Quran is filled with verses that say, for example, Ya Bani Israel, inni faddaltukum ala al-alamin, that, O children of Israel, I preferred you and chose you over other people. So we all believe them to be a chosen people. We believe them to be a special people. We believe them to be people of the book, and that's all within our scripture. Right. At the Battle of Uhud, a rabbi, his name was Al-Mukhayriq, he took part in the Battle of Uhud as a Jewish leader on the side of the Muslims, and he was killed. And the Prophet ﷺ described him as the best of the Jews. And what's interesting is that whatever money he had, he left behind to the Prophet ﷺ, who used it to start the first ever waqf for Muslims to support the poor and the needy. Right. So this is just a little bit of the history of the time of the Prophet ﷺ of some Jews. There were other, of course, incidents, but that's one of them. And historically speaking, religiously, Muslims never had a problem with Jews. The Christians did. The Christians actually believed that Jews facilitated the killing of their God, meaning Jesus. We've never believed that. And so therefore, religiously speaking, the term of anti-Semitism never existed amongst the Muslims, not primarily because Arabs are also from the sons of Sam. So they are Semites. But also the idea of anti-Semitism, as I said before, and I can't state enough, is a European idea. The hatred of the Jews, even here in England, the Jews were expelled by Edward I, the famous conqueror or the hammer of the Scots who fought Braveheart. He expelled the Jews. They hated him that much. In the Tower of York, if you go into York, the Clifford Tower, it's still there. 150 Jews were gathered in there because an entire mob had come to kill them, and they ended up either killing themselves or were killed. That happened in Britain. And then throughout, you've got plays by Shakespeare in which he describes Shylock as this character who wants his pound of flesh because he's so bloodthirsty. That's the embodiment of a Jew at the time of Shakespeare, and continued to the point at which, as I said, the final solution was developed by Europeans against European Jews. Where did the Muslims come in all of this?
Yes.
Every time the Muslims saved them, and then they come to Palestine en masse, and then displace the very people who saved them throughout history.
You could envisage a time in the future, inshallah, where Muslims have taken back that land and Jews live side by side with Muslims.
I think about it all the time. I imagine how Jews are living because they're people of the book. And, the Quran says, Ya Ahl al-Kitab, lastum ala shay hatta tuqim at-Torah. Oh, people of the book, you're not on anything until you establish the Torah and the Injil. So such people are welcomed. And that's why you'll find the Orthodox, which I find really odd. I consider myself, and I'm sure you do consider yourself to be an Orthodox Muslim. But in Judaism, or modern Judaism rather, the Orthodox are seen to be, the slightly more extreme religious people. Which means they're just the normal religious people. Most of them don't support the state of Israel. Really? Most of the Orthodox Jews, to repeat again, do not support the state of Israel.
Yeah. The Home Secretary in the UK sent out a memorandum to the various police forces suggesting that waving the Palestinian flag could potentially be an illegal act because Hamas is outlawed in this country and somehow there is a connection between the Palestinian flag and Hamas. Now, why do you think she felt the need to do that?
Well, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. First of all, it's an internationally recognized flag.
Right.
It's the flag of the Palestinian people, not just of Gaza.
Yeah.
So that means it includes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and representative of Palestinians. But what I think will entirely fail, because the attempt then would to this is not even about Hamas. Hamas has its own flag, by the way. This is not even Gaza. This is now all Palestinians. So I think she wouldn't be able to do this. I don't think it will work.
Yeah.
But the fact of throwing it out there is a scare tactic.
Right.
It's attempt to frighten people. And there are those who hear something that a politician has said it, therefore they assume it to be law, who will capitulate in front of that. My personal view is I'm not big on flag waving, regardless of whatever flag they are. But if I was to be a flag waver, I'd be running around picking up flags and waving them right in front of Suela Braverman.
Again, it's back to a question I asked you when we last spoke. Many young Muslims may decide to wear Palestinian flags or wear the Palestinian scarf to school. And we know from recent history that a number of them were presented to prevent for just that symbolic action. Do you advise them to be careful about this symbolic act of resistance, or would you suggest that they go ahead and do it?
I would think that they should speak to their schools, because there should be a relationship between the school and the pupil that goes beyond just education. There should be trust, there should be understanding, there should be an ability. After all, there is all of this for the child to be who he wants to be, or she wants to be, or it wants to be. Believing in your political beliefs is also a part of that.
Right.
So my diplomatic way for them is to approach the school, sit down and talk to them about it. We'd like to hold an event. We'd like to talk. We'd like to be able to wear these scarves. We'd like to be able to show solidarity, do fundraising for those affected by the starvation and so forth, and begin from that premise. If they are outlawed, if they are told that they cannot do it, then they can escalate that if they wish to. But I don't think anybody should simply say, well, I can't do that because they have said so in the guidelines. The law allows you freedom of expression, and that's the most basic premise that you can begin with.
Awesome. Tell me about, because Palestine isn't just Muslims, there are Christians in Palestine, and often they are forgotten in this conflict. How are the Christians treated by the Israelis?
So let's remember, there have been very prominent Christians within the Palestine resistance movements. For example, Hanan Ashrawi was the spokesman for the PLO for many, many years. She's a Christian. The founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, George Habash, was also a Christian. But there are Christians in Gaza, several thousand, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, of course, where all the Holy Sepulchre and all the Christian places exist. They're all brutalized. They get mistreated just as much. In fact, I think sometimes worse than the Muslims. And that is because extreme Jews believe Christians, or many of the Christians, to be idolaters. And they believe that when Jesus, alayhi salam, came, that he came and he was a rebel to the Jewish cause and was outside of their fold.
Right.
So there's a religious historical hatred, and you can see that manifest sometimes. You may have seen recent images of Christians walking past with the cross and Orthodox Jews or just Jews walking past, spitting right in front of them, as they describe that to be a tradition because of how they view Christ and Christians. So it's important that we recognize this. And as I said before, it doesn't matter whether you're Christian, Muslim, secular, liberal, believe in the one-state solution, two-state solution, Islamist or whatever. If you believe in resistance against occupation by the Zionist state, you will be deemed to be a terrorist.
So why do Christians in America, the evangelicals, so vehemently support the Israeli cause?
I would like to say, to be generous to them, that they don't know what they're doing. And just as an example, literally 2 days ago, the Israelis bombed and destroyed one of the oldest churches in the region that's 1,600 years old, in Gaza. They destroyed it.
Really?
Now, all of that is happening continuously. And as you said, the evangelical Christians and beyond support the Zionist state of Israel. If you look back in history, when the Crusaders came, and I think it was on the 4th Crusade, they didn't actually make it all the way to Jerusalem. They went as far as the Byzantine Constantinople, and they sacked and destroyed the land of their Christian brothers, meaning the Eastern Orthodox. And so I think that they have thrown their Christian Orthodox brothers and sisters under the Zionist bus because of their belief in and support of the state of Israel.
Finally, Moazzam, I get the impression that a number of Muslims are quite weird out. They're quite weary about just how dire things seem to be around the Muslim world, and just how much the Palestinian issue is now a fringe issue in many ways. And even those so-called progressive supporters of Palestine, because of the actions last Saturday, or superficially because of the actions last Saturday, are now questioning the Palestinian cause. And so there is this feeling that of hopelessness, maybe, that has crept into some Muslim activism. Is that a good place to be, really, as Muslims?
Muslims should always feel hopeful.
Yeah.
As one of the examples I often give from Guantanamo, I recently met members of the Taliban who were held in Guantanamo with me on a visit to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And one question I asked them was did you ever think that you would one day be seated in power as a senior minister?
Right.
And he said, I never lost hope. Not a single day.
Right.
In fact, I fully believed that we'd be back. I didn't think we'd be in government, but I believed we'd be back.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we stick to the Islamic principle of Allahumma al-malik al-mulk. Oh Allah, you are the King of Kings. Tu'ti al-mulka man tasha. You give your dominion to whoever you wish. وَتُنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ. And you remove it from whoever you wish. وَتُعِزُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ. And you honor who you wish. وَتُذِلُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ. And you debase who you wish. So really, in the end, Muslims should hold true to that belief that in the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that decides. All we have to do is our best.
Moazzam Begg, Jazakallah khair for your time today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.